Hey everybody, welcome back to Horror Trans. My name is Stephanie Bree. I am a transgender woman and I talk about all things horror. And today we're taking a look at the 1999, I believe, um, Tim Burton classic, air quotes, Sleepy Hollow. I have mixed feelings about Tim Burton's filmmaking, and as I've said elsewhere, uh, I'm not sold on him as a horror filmmaker. And that's largely because of this movie. Um, the movie itself is stylistically as Tim Burton as you can get. It's like Tim Burton has a playbook and this checks all the boxes. He's like, yeah, here's the checklist. Let's just do this, and this, and he does it all. So if you are a fan of Tim Burton's style, you might enjoy this movie. It does have some big names, which I'm not going to run through. The biggest name, though, I would say is Christina Ricci, who is underutilized in this movie for what it tries to do, which is retelling an American a horror story steeped in American literature. And I think it fails on a couple of reasons. One, um, like truly uniquely like legitimately original American stories as far as horror stories go don't really come into existence until the 1970s. Everything up to that point that had been produced by American studios, with possibly the exception being Alfred Hitchcock, which we'll talk about, um, is derivative of other cultures. Sleepy Hollow is really no exception to this. Um, it's trying it's an American author, an America set in America, uh, post-colonial times after the um, Revolutionary War, where Americans were still trying to find their identity and distance themselves from their Britishness, whereas American literature was still clinging to the British style of literature, which is the biggest problem I have with this movie. Is even though it's made by an American filmmaker, an American studio, and it's technically an American story, it feels very British. It doesn't feel American at all. Now, there's nothing wrong with British films, don't get me wrong, or British literature. Obviously, we have greats like, you know, William Shakespeare, and we have Charles Dickens. Those are, not Emily Dickinson, I think she's American, but you have Jane Eyre. Or is it Jane Austen? I'm mixing those up. Agatha Christie is another one. So, British literature is its own it has its own vibe. And American horror, especially by the 1990s, had really developed a voice and a tone that was decidedly not British. And that's where this movie doesn't work for me, is because it's made in America by an American, starring Americans, about a uniquely American story, but it feels too British. This feels like this movie, even though they didn't have the technology in 1776, this movie feels like it could have been made in 1776. And for me, that takes me out of the movie. I cannot enjoy this movie because it doesn't vibe with what I'm seeing from the horror landscape in 1999. I'm seeing stuff like Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, Final Destination would come out a year later, The Faculty. Very, very decidedly American stories. And even though technically this is based on a story written by an American author set in, America, on the continent North America, it just doesn't feel American to me. It doesn't feel like it fits in with what we saw in the 1990s. If this movie had come out 3 years later, after we had the Asian invasion, with Ring and Ringu, and we got the phenomenal, they're not horror movies, but Jet Li and some of those other kinds of movies invading Hollywood, you know, and I shouldn't say invading. That's a poor choice of words. Influencing Hollywood, and when we start to see things like the grunge, horror took a shift. Even 28 Days Later, which is decidedly British, works better for me at the time it came out, because we as a culture were kind of primed for that. But in 1999, this movie feels out of place. And when I watched it, not in theaters, but when I rented it on VHS, and I watched it, I was like, what the fuck am I watching? Even though it was a bloody movie and a horror movie at that, it felt like something we would have watched in English class, as a tie into our, American literature curriculum. It doesn't feel like a legit horror movie to me. And that's my problem with this movie. Now, take all of that with a grain of salt, because it is Tim Burton, which is a double whammy. You have this very weird tonally, this movie that just doesn't fit with the vibe of other horror movies at the time. And then you have this weird Tim Burton aesthetic on top of that. This movie is very jarring, because if you look at Tim Burton's other movies, there's nothing aside from maybe Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, nothing at all British about his movies. They're very, either agnostic culturally, they're just Western culture. They could take place anywhere, or very American, like Beetlejuice is very, New England. So when you have those two jarring and conflicting tones, you have the tone that is off and the aesthetic that is off. What you're left with is a poor story that is based on a not a very thick book. Um, Basically, a story you've read in English class, essentially, and you feel like watching this movie feels like I'm doing homework. It doesn't feel like I'm enjoying a movie to enjoy it. I feel like I should be taking notes, and that takes me out of the movie. I do not recommend Sleepy Hollow unless you are a fan of Tim Burton. But even then, I caution you to tread lightly, because this movie is not great. This is a rent at absolute best. Um, but I just don't. This movie doesn't do it for me. I don't have any good. I didn't have a good time watching this movie. I don't get good vibes when I'm watching this movie. I don't have good memories of this movie. There's just nothing for me to say, "Ooh, this is okay," or "I like this." There's nothing. There's nothing in this movie for me to say I like it. Excuse me. And I love Christina Ricci, but even her in this movie is so out of place, and I'm just watching it like, I don't know, they could have done more with her, because she was like a big name at the time, and I felt like she's in this movie and she's doing stuff, but it's like, is what she's doing important? I guess I don't know. This movie doesn't do it for me.